And Biden, I don't think, was especially cautious with his political capital, even though he's maybe a more moderate leaning politician in some ways. So we have these kind of two dimensions maybe of that. And to me, it's kind of like, how are they continuing some of these legacies, and also how are they breaking away? And that was the other thing I thought was really striking with Walz's speech, as he started with thanking Harris for bringing back the joy. And I'm like, bringing it back from what? Bringing it back from whom? Like, this is a pretty stark break with Biden. I don't think he really talked about Biden.
Hello, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to a new episode of Power and Flower. I am Seth Maskett.
And I'm John Hagner.
We are a political scientist and a political consultant who are trying to understand and explain what is going on in U.S. politics in 2024, which is a lot, and we also care deeply about pastries. In this episode, we are discussing the Democratic choice for Vice President, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, and in doing so, we are fortunate enough to be joined by Marquette University's political scientist, Dr. Julia Azari. Julia is the author of the 2014 book, Delivering the People's Message, The Changing Politics of the Presidential Mandate. She's also working on a book on the vice presidency with William Adler, and she is a member of the Good Politics, Bad Politics Substack, which you should all definitely be subscribing to. Also, you can hear her at the podcast Politics in Question, which has been going for several years now. And additionally, on top of all that, Julia came up with the title for this podcast, Power and Flower. So she's truly a person of Renaissance. Julia, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Certainly. So we've got a lot to discuss, and we're going to throw in some conversation about J.D. Vance, too, the Republican choice for vice president, since we really haven't had a chance to talk about him either. But I guess the first question I'll start with is, how would you, talk about the pick of Tim Walz in terms of sort of classic historical strategies for picking vice presidents? For example, John Kennedy picked Lyndon Johnson as a way to sort of balance the Democratic ticket with North and South. Clinton picked Al Gore as sort of a way to, reinforce his new Democratic message. What are we seeing with the Harris-Walz pick? What does this do?
All right, so I think there's kind of three things that are important here. The first one, I want to get this out of the way, and that's the state and regional strategy one. There are some debates about whether home state strategy matters. I think it's much more tenuous to claim that a regional strategy matters in the sense that just by existing, the Tim Walz is going to help the ticket in the Midwest, or specifically the upper Midwest or whatever. I don't think you two are people that are going to fight with me about the boundaries of the Midwest, but that can be a bonus episode if you want.
Somewhere in the middle of Pennsylvania, fights. Should we have that fight? Yeah, okay.
I would not say that if I were you.
Okay.
I think Buffalo's in the Midwest, but I'm an outlier on that one.
Oh man.
No,
okay.
R.I.P. both of your inboxes. So. Okay, what were we talking about? I'm sorry. Let me get through my train of thought. Okay, so region is a thing, but it is not a thing that Walz is going to do just by existing. Second is ideology. Ideology is kind of complicated. We have a lot of different ways to measure it, but I think one of the things that's interesting about Walz is that if you look at some of the traditional ways of measuring his ideology, his scores in Congress, the dime measure, which is the donation score, he comes off as similar to or to the right of Harris. I think slightly left by one of those measures, but similar. And what William and I have found in the research we've been doing on the vice presidency is there's kind of an asymmetry, the foreshadow or talk about Vance. Republicans have tended to balance the ticket to the right, and Democrats have tended either to pick someone who's quite similar to themselves or balances slightly to the center. And I think Walz sort of fits with that, but with this sort of 2024 twist that he has this really progressive record as governor of Minnesota, and seemed to be, to me anyway, to be sort of the favorite of the left, of the, kind of potential viable candidates. The third thing I think ties these other two things together, and that's something you don't hear a lot at all in the punditry and is really an important missing factor, and that's campaign skill. And that is where I kind of see, with Walz, we have a sort of record of that. 6 years of or 6 terms of winning a really complicated, mostly Republican district in Minnesota, but also the way that he immediately came on the scene. Nobody knew who he was. I mean, I study this and I live in an adjacent state. And if you'd asked me a month ago who was the governor of Minnesota, like it might have taken me 2 tries. And he comes on the scene and he really masters the moment and masters that media moment and gets all this, media attention, immediately becomes a really happy and positive meme. And I think this type of campaign skill, whatever it is in a given moment, if it's TV, if it's the internet, if it's the stump, and Walz, I think, has sort of shown skill in all three. That's what brings you the regional advantage. That's what brings you the ideological advantage. It needs a mechanism. So the vice presidential candidate doesn't bring this stuff just by breathing. And I think that's what's been missing from pretty much all the punditry. So that's my take on Walz.
Yeah, and I think that's really smart, and there's a ton to unpack there. But before we dig into it, the same question that Seth asked about Walz, what do you think that Trump was trying to do with Vance? Like, how would you put him in a similar framework?
Yeah, so not to endlessly promote my Substack, but in fact to do that. After Vance was picked, I wrote a piece that the title was something like "Vance is the pick of an emboldened Trump." This is a pick of a candidate who was very confident about his position and trying to solidify his ideological position in the party. This is not somebody who is likely to have a lot of crossover appeal. This is not somebody who is a safe pick in terms of how media attention works. When you pick someone who doesn't have a huge national profile, who hasn't run for president themselves, you're running the risk of the media is going to pay a lot of attention to that person. And that can be good. It can be good. It can also be bad. And if you follow J.D. Vance's career, you sort of knew he'd made all these statements that are going to be really different from what maybe the balance of national public opinion is. I think Vance was really the pick of solidifying the base, of Trump sort of satisfying his own need for somebody who was very similar to him and who would tell him what he wanted to hear, someone who'd be loyal in a January 6th situation, and was very confident in his electoral position when he made the pick.
Do you see this? I mean, are these some ways like mirror picks in the sense that you have the presidential candidates are both like, they're from the coast, and they both sort of recognize that the real battleground here is in the upper Midwest. And so they both went with someone kind of from that region to both, thinking it gives them an edge. I mean, is there a similarity there, or do you think that there's just a lot, ideologically just very different motivations here?
I would tend toward the ideologically different motivations. I'm sure the region piece doesn't hurt, but and Minnesota and Ohio were sort of mirrors in that sense, right? In that Ohio used to be the sort of predictor of presidents, and it's not anymore. It's now pretty solidly in the red column. And Minnesota is competitive, but has been very consistently Democratic in presidential races. I mean, I think it's also instructive to think about recent regional and home state picks. And here I'm riffing a lot on this book from 2020 about how targeted running mate selections don't usually work. Tim Kaine didn't seem to help in the South. That's very unsurprising. And Paul Ryan in 2012 didn't help Mitt Romney, particularly in Wisconsin. Yeah. And so I think my tendency is to think this has much more to do with this sort of these soft elements of the vice president, of these vice presidential candidates, how they overall kind of reflect the values of the candidacy and what they could do for the ticket.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the people who I know mostly thought that Harris was going to pick Shapiro for that home state effect, right? That I think it's pretty universally understood that Pennsylvania is the key tipping point state, that, as goes Pennsylvania, probably goes the election. Shapiro is incredibly popular in Pennsylvania, So I think the conventional wisdom and the people that I talked to was, oh, don't overthink this. Like 60% popular governor of Pennsylvania, that's what she's going to do. And I think a lot of people were surprised. Do you think that had she picked Shapiro, that you would expect a positive effect in Pennsylvania? Or is your research show that it sort of doesn't matter?
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't directly looked at this, but the people who have, again, there's a little bit of a debate. There's kind of one perspective that the home state advantage can matter a little bit at the margins. and that might matter for Pennsylvania. And then there's this sort of argument that essentially, no, it doesn't. And, I think that the elephant in the room, obviously, with Shapiro is that, for fairly or unfairly, the conversation around him touched on his sort of relationship, his statements about some of the Gaza protests in Pennsylvania, and that just became part of his political profile. I know that there were concerns that that's not particularly fair. He is Jewish. Does that sort of make that a bigger part of his political profile than is fair? But I think there's no way to avoid it. Why would you pick somebody who is going to press at probably the worst division in the Democratic Party if you could not do that? I also think, I want to say one other thing about Shapiro, which is that reports have suggested that he also really, his questions and comments in their kind of meetings suggested that he would really like to be at the top of the ticket. It's likely he had 2028 designs. And at seeing him speak, he is sort of made for the top of the ticket. Seeing Tim Walz, he is made for the second slot. There's no way he was going to be in presidential politics on his own, right? And I think that makes a lot of sense to pick somebody who is really going to settle into the role of vice president, especially given Harris's demographics and positionality.
Oh, that all makes sense. So you actually have a piece up at the Substack Good Politics, Bad Politics this week called Midwest Rising, in which you focus on the ways that Walz either uses or doesn't use sort of traditional Midwestern populist rhetoric. Now, obviously, there's lots of differences between liberal and conservative populism, but generally what they have in common is like they point to some like corrupt group or institution that's ruining things for regular folks. And I'm curious, is this something you see Walz doing? Who is he aiming at? Who are the regular folks? How does what he's doing differ from, say, the populism of Vance or Sarah Palin or Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, I think about populism in this kind of granular way, that rather than identifying candidates as populist or not populist, to sort of break down the different elements of populism and look for it in different pieces of rhetoric. And there I thought what was most interesting about Walz was what he didn't say. What was most interesting about what Walz was saying to me was that he didn't use his time in Congress to talk about what a mess Washington is. He didn't even really talk about rich people, except when he was talking about Donald Trump. He used a little bit of populism to kind of talk about Trump using his position to help his rich friends. He talked about J.D. Vance going to Yale. As a Yale alum, I was fine with that. It was, that's both J.D. Vance and I got our graduate degrees there. We're not undergraduate Yale alums, but just to clarify. But it was very targeted. It wasn't widespread populism. It wasn't aimed at institutions. So in that sense, I would actually say it's not really populism. What he did was instead, I think, is he took out this element that's been associated with right-wing populism in the U.S., which is talking about ordinary people and sort of valorizing the ordinary and valorizing sort of small town life, regular people, small business owners, has been a part of kind of 20th century Republican populist rhetoric. And instead sort of broadened that out and talked about that ordinariness in a way that is particularly kind of stressing the inclusiveness of LGBT people, but in stressing a sort of a broader inclusiveness of, what it means to be ordinary is to be kind and decent and accepting of other people. And that's kind of different from what we've seen. As kind of different from recent discourse around the heartland and around kind of who is normal and who is real America. Jamel Bowie also wrote about this today, using kind of similar themes. And to me, it was a real refutation of not just the 2016 notion of the heartland rejecting Democrats, but also the geography of the 2004 election, where I think a lot of this contemporary discourse came out of. And it was sort of like, liberals are the latte and sushi people. And for Walz, it was kind of like, you can challenge those distinctions and dichotomies. So I thought it was really fascinating, almost kind of anti-populist rhetoric.
Yeah, I think in Walz's speech, he actually makes explicit reference to you may have known Republicans in the past who were focused on personal freedom, and that's not where the party is anymore. Like he wasn't just being implicit in that. At some points, he was really calling it out. Like if you think of yourself as a Republican because you care about personal freedom, check the party that you're supporting, because
Right.
that's not really who they are anymore.
Yeah, I was sort of struck by the education bit, which I guess was just mainly directed at JD Vance, but and Yale specifically. But that did sort of stand out to me as kind of traditional, just saying, the folks I know didn't go to Yale. But you're right, like everything else, he wasn't really like, particularly for someone who was in Congress for a number of years and then came home to serve his state. He could have had a basis of saying Washington is a mess, and he didn't.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was it's an interesting departure.
Walz is very different from the historic precedent for the Democratic Party in a couple ways, right? It's the first time in many, many years that we have not had an Ivy League person, right? That Walz has degrees from two different state schools, but he's also the first governor in 100 years that Democrats have nominated for vice president. I think 100 years is correct. And I think, Julia, you were talking about the sort of dichotomy between, is he, his congressional record is quite moderate. He's done a lot of progressive things in the states. I think it's really interesting, for so many Democrats, and as everybody knows, that's what I do for a living, and that's who I talk to. Washington is a place that feels much more ideological than the states. That as Washington has gotten slowed down, there's a ton of really interesting stuff happening in state houses and in governor's mansions, and I think elevating Walz out of a state, and it's a state that I happen to live in. So I did know about Walz before 2 weeks ago, unlike most people in America. I think is a really interesting sort of way of moving out of some of those ideological debates, right? Like Walz isn't a Medicare for all guy. These fights that felt so important in 2020 are completely irrelevant now, but Walz has gotten a bunch of stuff done. And I think that's what, more than anything, I think what Harris was trying to bring to the ticket is, we can actually accomplish things with power. To me, the most inspiring thing about Walz's entire record is, he talked about once Democrats in Minnesota have a 1-seat majority in the state house, that they won by 150 votes or something, right? The thinnest of margins, but have full trifecta control here. And his approach to that was, great, let's accomplish our entire agenda. Right. And he was quoted saying, when you have political capital, the goal is to spend it. Right. You don't sit on it. You don't hoard it. That's a sea change in the way the Democrats approach things. Right. Like, as I have come up in this party, we wanted a majority. So everybody hunker down. Don't make anybody mad. Hold on for dear life. And I think that the Walz approach of, hey, we can do stuff. Let's do the things that we said we would. I don't know that that's left or right ideology. I think it's the party is moving toward a let's actually accomplish things instead of talk about things, and that's something that only happened in the States.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, and when you put it the way you put it, it's actually almost like a direct George W. Bush quote from 2005. I have political capital and I intend to spend it, which then I think was the lead into trying to reform Social Security.
Yeah.
Doing something only his party liked, and it was trash fire. And even his own party didn't like it. But so I got to think on that some more now that I brought it up. Here's where I stand with this sort of Democratic Party piece, and I'd like to know what you all think. How this all maps onto the existing divisions in the Democratic Party is still a little bit of a mystery to me. What I think is interesting is the relationship between what's come immediately before. And I haven't read it yet, but I know Jonathan Chait has something up about Bidenism and Obamaism, and I'm not totally convinced those are different. But Obama was very cautious with his political capital, I think. And Biden, I don't think, was especially cautious with his political capital, even though he's maybe a more moderate-leaning politician in some ways. So we have these kind of two dimensions maybe of that. And to me, it's kind of like, how are they continuing some of these legacies, and also how are they breaking away? And that was the other thing I thought was really striking with Walz's speech, as he started with thanking Harris for bringing back the joy. And I'm like, bringing back from what? Bringing back from who? Like, this is a pretty stark break with Biden. I don't think he really talked about Biden. And so to me, and Walz is not a politician of sort of the Biden era or even the Obama era, right? He ran for Congress in 2006. So he's actually a politician of the Bush era. Or like maybe early Obama era. So, this is something I think we don't think about timing enough when we think about ideology on a presidential ticket. We don't think enough about, well, when did someone enter politics and how does that shape their affiliations and stances? This is very rambly. I apologize.
Yeah. This is really interesting. Like the Obama thing, I think, and this gets back to what John was talking about, that sort of distinction between spending capital versus hoarding it. There was that key moment in, end of 2009, early 2010, when Teddy Kennedy died, and the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, looked very unpopular, and Democrats were trying to decide, is this a time to just sort of cut this whole health reform process because it looked like it was going to hurt the party? Obama, judging from just the reporting I've heard from that era, like Obama seemed to be leaning toward maybe killing this whole effort. And it was largely Nancy Pelosi who has much more the orientation toward let's spend the capital while we have it.
Rahm Emanuel wanted to kill the effort, right?
Yeah, I think he did. Yeah, that was my understanding.
But the same...
And it's just... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Nancy Pelosi is the most important politician of her generation for many reasons, and I think that's one of them. I think the fact that she's the person who kept the Affordable Care Act, and she's the person who got, in a lot of ways, both Kamala Harris and Tim Walz on this ticket, right? Like she is the force behind a lot of the things we've been discussing.
Yeah. But there is also the sense that, like, I agree with your characterization of Biden, that he has not been that cautious, that he has been about, like, using what thin margins he has to actually get things done. He also turned out to be fairly unpopular. I don't think that's the reason why. But I think there's probably other reasons motivating that. But he wasn't necessarily rewarded for much for delivering a lot for the Democrats. Indeed, they forced him out.
So I do think that the common thread between all of these things is the increased polarization that's happening, right? Like I was the DCCC's targeting and analytics director in 2010. So it was my job to try to sort of pick up the pieces after the Affordable Care Act fight and see where Democrats could win. And going into the 2010 election, we had a ton of Democrats in very Republican seats, right? What was pretty common in America then was, districts that would vote one party for president, one party for House. So I think part of why Obama may have been a little bit more cautious is that he was dealing with a much more unwieldy coalition. Over the subsequent years, so many districts, in part because we lost 63 seats in 2010 when I was the targeting analytics director, not all my fault. We
don't blame you.
We had come into such alignment where, the Biden majority was much more, it was much smaller than the Obama majority, but it was also much more ideologically coherent. And they represented districts that overwhelmingly had supported Biden in his race against Trump. And I think, we see the same thing with Walz. He represented a tough district. He voted his district. He also, I think, was smart enough to get out of his district and into a statewide race before some of the Trump-led realignment happened. He won in 2016, but it's only gotten harder for Democrats in Trump districts. It's only gotten harder for Republicans in Biden districts. And I think, you talked about timing, Julia. I think part of his story is the timing of going to a statewide race and having a more Democratic constituency has freed him up to do other things. I think that polarization and that sort of people retreating into their partisan camps, I think impacts every single part of American politics.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's another piece, not to like endlessly flog the various work that I'm doing, but one of the motivations for William Adler and me to write this book is to really connect vice presidential selection to party politics and like place it in developments in party politics, which is not typically been done. It's sort of like, well, did this person pick a moderate or a conservative or whatever? And the meaning and significance of those terms changes over time.
So I had a question for you along those very lines about this, and this is a subject that I'm always interested in, and I'm hoping this is something that you are going to get into your book. is about just how much the choice of vice presidential candidate is just like a personal decision by the presidential candidate. Is it a party decision? How should we be thinking about it? So, like, I mean, I think famously John McCain was at least playing with the idea of picking Joe Lieberman as a running mate. And, people within his party were like, you can't do that. And he backed off the idea. But I think within fairly broad, guidelines, they can kind of pick who they want. But I'm sure it depends. Was this a different situation with Kamala Harris? And she became the presidential nominee very rapidly and with a lot of party help. I'm curious how you see this unfolding.
Yeah, this is a good question. And I think that some of this feels a little bit too recent for me to have a really good read on, but I'm going to do my best and speculate wildly. So one of the things William and I argue, one of the things we argue is actually the party makes much more of a difference than people think. And even in this sort of presidency centered era, that the party's influence presidential, they influence the short list, that the sort of broadly, what do you all call it, the networked party, the various interest groups. My co-author has done a lot of archival research looking at some of the memos that have been sent around to different campaigns, and looking at this at different points in kind of 20th century history. And one of the things I thought was sort of most interesting that is, we have very few data points, so
right,
caveat, but when let's see if I can get this correct. When the election looks more competitive, you typically see vice presidential candidates that are closer to kind of the party's ideological median. Then when the election looks less competitive, they're more likely, they're in a more advantaged position, then presidents pick someone closer to themselves. And that was something, that was part of our 2018 APSA paper that we shamefully is still sitting on our hard drives, but will be part of this book. So there is this kind of evidence of kind of like the party is doing something. So what does this mean for Vance and Walz? I don't know. I think for Vance, it's sort of evidence that the kind of Trumpist movement is increasingly the Republican Party. And also in some ways that maybe some of the more traditional party actors had even less influence. I thought 2 weeks out it was going to be Doug Burgum, and that was going to be similar to Mike Pence. I mean, I think Pence is totally a party pick. You can totally tell. You can hear some Republican advisors saying, pick this guy, he does these things. And not hear them saying that about Vance, who was not a reassuring pick to an establishment Republican, or really anybody else, and except Trump's sons. With Harris, I actually saw Walz as the more party pick as well, and this is again thinking about Shapiro as maybe the other choice. One of the reasons I think Shapiro remained on the list was actually that he and Harris seemed to have had a relationship before and worked well together before. And that's a reasonable thing for a presidential candidate to be worried about. But Walz seems much more like, okay, here's how we're going to build out this sort of broader party reputation. And here's the candidate that's more favored by labor, that's going to be potentially more of somebody who is mobilizing to LGBT groups, these like different elements and components of the party. One thing I think really national punditry discourse really sleeps on is the role of labor in the Democratic Party. And Walz was really the only candidate, I think, on the short list who hadn't done something that irritated labor at one point or another.
Walz is the first card-carrying union member to be on the Democratic ticket in a very long time. He was a member of the teachers union.
Right. Which is, I mean, I think teachers unions as a sort of force in the Democratic Party are frequently not written about in the New York Times, but probably still fairly significant.
Yeah, and Shapiro's biggest problem with labor was the teachers in Pennsylvania. Shapiro had supported vouchers in theory.
I talked to someone who's a union organizer, and that person said, we just want whoever's going to win. So I might be attributing more sort of delicate preferences to unions, but it was quite notable to me that Kelly had trouble with some labor stuff. Walz was clearly the labor pick.
Yeah. I think it's been interesting. You talked about Vance not necessarily being reassuring. Usually, and you've got more historical expertise than I do, but usually you expect a relatively unknown VP nomination gets introduced at the convention, gets rolled out, and you should see a bump in popularity that you've got control of some part of the narrative. I think it's been really interesting to see how much Vance has just flopped, right? And people who like Donald Trump but who are intending to vote for Donald Trump telling pollsters like, we do not like this guy. Do you think that's just sort of the pessimism of the age that we're in, or do you think that is a sign that the Vance choice was a mistake?
I find it very hard to imagine that people won't think of the Vance choice as a mistake, because the thing about Vance is his whole career is really about being a media figure. He doesn't really, I'm not trying to throw shade here, but he doesn't have any real political accomplishments. He's been in the Senate for 2 years. And Obama, who I also think was not experienced enough to be president, at least had been in the state legislature. And so he had some real political experience. Vance does not have any. Not to speak of. And so he's not really bringing that. His whole thing is like he wrote a book and he's a bomb thrower and media like to talk about it. So somebody like that is at the outset a horrible choice for vice president, because that is the last thing you want your vice presidential candidate to do, is to be out there provoking and attracting media attention for that. That's so risky. So then you add to that they have all these sort of off-median positions, and he's just kind of like not a charismatic media personality, like Trump is a charismatic media personality, and people like him and are fascinated by him and have been for, my whole life. I've known who Donald Trump was, and people have been kind of drawn to him. Vance is not like that. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing is like he is truly a figure of right-wing media. Pence was too, but Pence also had a legitimate political resume and connections within the party. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah,
but
no, it does.
Doing my best.
If it's okay, I'd love to pivot to our food section here. This is a portion of our show we call Pastry Tips. Usually a focus on baking, but since we have some legit Midwest cred here on the show today, I have very little. I've done some research in Iowa and eaten a few pork sandwiches. John has lived in Minnesota for a few years now, but Julia has legit upper Midwest cred. So we have this interesting thing on the Democratic ticket right now. We do have some ticket balancing. We've got a California foodie and a kind of a Minnesota comfort food guy. And we're starting to hear more about like Midwestern cuisine. So I would love to just sort of open up with a question. First of all, what is the difference between hot dish and casserole?
My understanding is hot dish is a Minnesota term.
Really?
Specifically from Mankato.
It's a linguistic difference.
It's from Mankato, which is where Tim Walz's hometown, yeah.
Right. So I said something about casserole because I'm not going to say hot dish. That's cultural appropriation. So I have to explain. I've lived in Wisconsin for 17 years, and I also went to college and high school in Illinois. So I've lived in the Midwest for most of my life. My family's not Midwestern, so I've had to learn all these dishes on my own. So I wasn't going to say hot dish. I said casserole, and I have a former graduate student who I will name here because he's a history PhD who has written some brilliant things on this very topic of Midwestern rural progressives. So legit, read Corey for that. His food takes, not so much. So he started yelling at me about saying casserole and not hot dish. It got very intense. But brilliant research. So it's a terminology thing. And Tim Walz has some recipes on the internet for a hot dish. I think a really classic way to approach this is tater tots.
Okay.
And cream of mushroom soup is a sort of other key element.
Yeah.
I am a purist. When I do this, it is tater tots, it is cream of mushroom soup, it is onions, and it is Impossible crumbles because I'm a vegetarian. That is it. That is what I make, and it's delicious. Maybe a little garlic or onion powder. Tim Walz, peas.
What does he do?
Peas. No, no to the peas.
So the single greatest
that's my take.
The single greatest day of my political career. In 2012, I was the field director at the Democratic Senate Campaign Committee, but I got sent out for the last month to North Dakota for the Heidi Heitkamp camp race, which we knew was competitive. No one in America thought was competitive. All my friends thought I had been demoted by being sent to North Dakota. But Garrison Keillor, who was a big supporter of the Democratic Party, came to North Dakota and he said, "What do you want me to do?" And what we did was a 4-city hot dish competition tour with all of our volunteers. It was the greatest day of get out the vote shift recruitment, because in order to enter the contest and have Garrison Keillor eat your hot dish, you had to sign up to canvass to get the vote out in North Dakota. And he went around and judged. We were in Fargo, Bismarck, Minot, and Grand Forks all in one day. And he ate probably 100 hot dishes and picked the winner in each one of them. So yeah, Julia's absolutely right. Cream has got some sort of cream soup. It's got to be tater tots if to do it right to win. And yeah, we all gained 10 pounds and won that election. So, hot dish makes it happen.
That's excellent.
Fantastic. Well, okay, that has been an education for me. And Julia, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
And thank you all for listening. And we will have another episode up soon. But thank you so much and take care. Thank you very much for listening to Power and Flower. This episode was produced by Eli Maskin. We will be recording throughout this election season up until the November election.